We're going to talk for about a half an hour and then leave it open for about 15 minutes or so questions. I wanted to start by kind of setting the stage a little bit for this quite complicated story. What was the year of Africa?
So in 1960, 17 African nations became independent. Former colonies now independent. And at the beginning of the year, no one even knew how many were going to become independent. And Congo was one of those. It had been a Belgian colony, and the Belgians finally agreed to let it become independent.
And who was Patrice Lumumba?
So he was Congo's prime minister upon independence. He was born in 1925 and really had a remarkable rise from humble circumstances. He was born in the middle of Belgian Congo in a small village. He moved to a bigger city, took up work as a postal clerk, sort of joining the Belgian colonial administration, which was the only route available to advancement at that time, and then got arrested for embezzling money from the post office, went to jail, became a little more politically aware in jail, and then when he was released, reinvented himself as a beer promoter in the capital of Congo, and that was where he started really getting involved in politics and co-founded a political party.
So I didn't know very much about him before I read your book, and I had always assumed that the embezzlement was like a trumped up charge by the Belgian colonialists, but it turns out he actually really was a thief at that point in his life.
Yeah, he did it, he admitted to it. Two things should be said though. One, he was making a fifth of what his white colleagues were for the exact same job. So he was, getting a raw deal already at the post office, as he himself pointed out. And the other is there was a sort of political element to the book was really thrown at him. He was guilty, that was clear, but he got treated more harshly than some thought others in his position would have, because he had been this sort of, he had been active in local political circles and was a big man around town. And so there was a sense that the local colonial officials were punishing him, not just for the embezzlement, but also for being too prominent.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he wasn't stealing from Belgians, he was stealing from small black business people.
Some of them were Congolese, some of them would have been Belgian.
Yeah. And he was, his run was unbelievably short in office, just a few months. But before we get to that, how did he become prime minister, and what were the circumstances of the Belgian withdrawal?
So Belgium realized very, very late that it could no longer hold on to its colony. So to give one example of this, in 1955, a Belgian academic wrote an essay, a little pamphlet called the 30-Year Plan for the Independence of Belgian Congo. The idea being that by 1985, the country would finally be ready to be independent. He almost lost his job because this was seen as a heretical thing to argue way too fast. It would have to take decades longer than that. Things changed really quickly in the late 1950s. Belgium looked around and saw that what the French were facing in Algeria, there was a riot in Congo. They then switched tacks completely and decided they had to offload their colony as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Lumumba has co-founded this political party and started, crisscrossing Congo, also going to other African countries and talking in more Pan-African terms. And then in the beginning of 1960, Belgium has this conference with the Congolese where they sort of hash out the details of independence. And that's where they decide June 30th, that's the date of independence. In May, they had elections, parliamentary elections, and Lumumba won the most and therefore was prime minister upon independence.
And unlike some other European colonies, like 3/4 of the whites fled, basically?
Yeah, there was a white flight sort of before independence, but then mainly after independence, and when there was this crisis and an army mutiny. And just backing up a bit, I mean, the whole Belgian idea was they had this phrase, no elites, no problems. And so they really prevented Congolese from achieving higher education, for instance. In 1960, there were fewer than 20 Congolese graduates of a university in the entire world, and only 2 of them were in Lumumba's government. So they had really sort of prevented any local political and technical elite from developing.
What I find so interesting about that, first of all, it's a really stark contrast to, say, Kenya, you know, where in the British colonies there was some of the French colonies, there was a real colonial elite in universities. But also, Eisenhower, we're going to get to him, does not exactly cover himself in glory, but he assumed that it was an illiterate country, but actually, surprisingly, given what you just said, they had a very high literacy rate.
Yeah, they had one of the highest literacy rates in Africa, and the explanation is the Belgians invested a lot in primary education, but then it stopped suddenly, and so you could learn to read, but there were no Congolese doctors, lawyers, you know, anything at that more elite level. You could be a clerk, but you couldn't be a lawyer. You could be a tradesman, but not an architect, that sort of thing.
So he got on the wrong side of the CIA because they thought he was a communist, but he wasn't a communist, right?
Right. So after independence, everything goes to hell in a handbasket within days. The army mutinies, the province secedes, and Lumumba first turns to the UN for help. They set up this massive peacekeeping operation. That's not working to his satisfaction. He flies to the US, goes to DC, asks America for help, gets rebuffed, and only then does he turn to the Soviets. And so that's really where this accusation that he was communist and pro-Soviet crystallized.
And in the meantime, on his American trip, it was really interesting the different reactions that people had to him in Washington and New York. Some people, as we were just discussing, thought he was on drugs. Other people thought he was a grifter because he went on the Upper East Side and bought a bunch of expensive stuff and then didn't pay for it. And other people thought, well, he seems fine. He didn't get to meet with Eisenhower, but he did have this really important, he had a bad meeting with Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Secretary General of the UN. But he had an even worse meeting in Washington, which was sort of at the root of some of his problems. So
Right.
what happened in Washington?
So he goes to Washington hoping he can meet with Eisenhower. Eisenhower's out of town. This is interpreted as a snub. In fact, he was just out of town. The trip was planned at the last minute. So he has this meeting with secretaries of the state at the time, Christian Herter, and everything Lumumba asks for, he doesn't get. So he's asking for direct U.S. bilateral aid. He doesn't get it. He wants an airplane because he's been prevented from flying across the Congo to various cities. The Belgians have prevented him from doing that. He's denied that. And so later this meeting would sort of take on a lot of importance because of what happened next and the CIA's moves against him. But the contemporaneous accounts suggest that, on a substantive level, Lumumba failed, but stylistically he was fine and he impressed them. Later, however, in the 70s, one of the participants of the meeting would claim that Lumumba was, quote, psychotic, and just had this tremendous flow of words and none of it made sense, which I think was probably a sort of ex post facto justification of the things that would happen later.
So Eisenhower actually did have a good excuse for not meeting with him. He was at the Republican convention in Chicago, which was nominating Nixon, so that wasn't something that he could get out of to
Right.
meet this newbie prime minister. But then he, in this chilling scene in the cabinet room, how much after the trip to Washington was that?
2 weeks.
2 weeks later, he basically says what?
Kill Lumumba. So there's this August 18th, 1960 meeting, and Congo comes up, Lumumba's latest antics are discussed, and then Eisenhower looks directly at Alan Dulles, the director of the CIA, and says something to the effect, we don't know the exact words, that Lumumba had to be eliminated physically, and making it clear whose whose job it was to do that. So we know this through a few ways. One, the note taker at the meeting would testify to the church committee that he doesn't remember the exact words, but he'll always remember clearly what was implied by Eisenhower's comment.
The church committee, just quickly, was in 1975, Senator Frank Church of Idaho held these blockbuster hearings where all of the secrets of the CIA, not all, but a very large number of secrets spilled out into public in this post-Watergate environment where people wanted to know the truth about what had happened. So a lot of this came out in 1975, but
Right.
so keep going.
So yeah, the note taker testified to the church committee about, I remember this. And actually, I just got an email the other day from the son of the note taker who said, thanks for your book. And by the way, my father was a total Boy Scout, like extremely honest to a fault man. And so he's all the more trustworthy, which I wish I had known.
What was the note taker's name? Did he go on and do
Robert Johnson. And he was a sort of, faceless bureaucrat in the National Security Council. But had his claim to fame was linking Eisenhower to the assassination operation. The other detail we know, so at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas, I found these handwritten notes from that meeting written by a State Department official. And I was flipping through them, and there is the word Lumumba in cursive, and then next to that is a big black X. So that could mean many different things, but it could also mean one particular thing.
And the reason there's so much suspicion that this is true, even though he was not killed directly by the CIA, but the reason that the attempt to kill him has so much credence involves a guy named Larry Devlin. So who was Larry Devlin?
Right, so he was the CIA station chief in Congo at the time, 37, 38 years old. Suddenly, he was given a posting that was thought to be a backwater where nothing exciting was going to happen, and all of a sudden it becomes the Cold War crisis of the moment. And so the result of that August 18 meeting, another reason we can know that Eisenhower said what he is alleged to have said, is that the CIA kicks into high gear and begins this operation where poisons are flown from the US to Congo, a vial of poisons. They're handed to the station chief, Larry Devlin, and he's told to put them in Lumumba's food or toothpaste. And when he asks, he's surprised to hear this mission, he asks who authorized this. He's told President Eisenhower.
And the events on the ground were greatly complicated by a separatist movement, by Katangan separatists, a sort of breakaway province of the Congo. And to sort of deal with that and various other complexities connected to the decolonization, the UN had a big presence, and the main presence in the country was a guy named Ralph Bunche, who used to be very, very well known. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, I believe, for the armistice in between Israel and Arab nations in 1949 after the Israeli War of Independence. So he was a very famous guy in this country. Why don't you talk a little bit about him and what his attitude was toward Congo and the Congo and Lumumba in particular?
Yeah, so Ralph Bunche, as you said, he's someone who was extremely famous. He presented the Academy Awards one year, in fact, because he was so famous. And he was the most prominent African American in public life at the time, or at least one of them. And he's sort of been forgotten by history. But his role in Congo was he was an American diplomat who worked for the UN, worked for Dag Hammarskjöld. He was sent to Congo for the independence ceremonies to represent the UN, and then when the crisis broke out, became the head of the UN mission there, because the UN sent thousands of peacekeepers. And part of this job was to meet with Lumumba, and he and Lumumba were like oil and water and absolutely did not get along. Bunche, in his private diary, referred to Lumumba as a jungle demagogue and a was real intense distaste. But the fundamental misunderstanding was Lumumba wanted the UN troops to be sent into Katanga and bring it back into the fold and reunite the country and allow Lumumba to exert power there. Bunch, and by extension the UN, thought that would be a terrible idea. It would kick off this war because the separatists would oppose the UN. And so this was the nut of the disagreement, and that was why Lumumba ended up calling on the Soviet Union for military help, thinking, okay, if the UN's not going to do it, I'll send in my own troops, but I need planes and trucks and so on.
In those days, the UN was much more aggressive. They had just been involved, UN troops. Now we think of them as peacekeepers, but they had actually fought. The troops of different countries had fought in Korea just a few years earlier. Mm-hmm. So the UN had a different role at this point, which we'll get to when we, in the post-Lumumba part of the conversation. But they were like soldiers who were fighting in Katanga, basically, right?
Yeah, I mean, the UN of 1960 is unrecognizable today. This was a moment where the Secretary General was seen as powerful. The New York Times would have stories on the front page about what the UN Security Council did yesterday. And as you said, thousands of UN troops who were drawn from mainly other African countries, but wearing blue helmets and fighting on behalf of the UN, were responsible for restoring order to an entire country.
So, and there's you even have a scene where Adlai Stevenson, who was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, is making some kind of presentation on that relates to Congo. I guess this was after the assassination.
Yeah, because that's the Kennedy administration.
Right, the Kennedy administration, and there's a protest in the chamber, the General Assembly chamber, which by that point had been, it was under construction earlier, but it had been completed. And who was among the protesters?
Maya Angelou makes a brief cameo in my book.
Yeah, and there's a letter to the editor earlier in 1960 by an exchange student at the University of Hawaii who had come from Kenya but had some experience in the Congo when he was younger. And this was, I think this letter was published a few months before his wife had a baby. Why don't you?
That was Barack H. Obama Sr. I stumbled across this, I'm not the first to find this, but a letter to the editor he wrote, sort of, the newspaper, the Honolulu Star or whatever, had written this pro-Belgian thing about Congo, and he fought back against that and said, actually, the Belgians are terrible in Congo. I've been there. I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I did a piece once about his coming to the United States, which is its own very interesting African story. What happened after Devlin started this assassination plot? Things kind of spun out of control and ended differently than I think, certainly than I assumed. I didn't have, in my sort of poorly informed mind, I didn't have the right assassins in my head. So what actually happened?
So Devlin is tasked with getting this poison into Lumumba's food or toothpaste, but he can't do it because by then, and this is September 1960, October 1960.
He's only been in office since March or something, right?
Since June 30th.
June 30th.
And on September 5th, he's the president of Congo, a man named Joseph Kasavubu, announces that he's firing Lumumba. Lumumba turns around and says, "You can't fire me, I fire you." So the two top leaders in Congo have announced their mutual dismissal. Into that void steps a young military officer and friend of Lumumba named Joseph Mobutu, who, as people may know, would go on to become Congo's dictator for over 30 years. And he takes power in this coup with CIA encouragement and cash, and throws Lumumba under house arrest, which is why, in fact, Devlin is unable to get the poisons to him. And it's interesting, you can read the cables, and headquarters headquarters in DC is saying like, what's up with this assassination operation? Like, let's get moving. And Devlin says, oh, I'm really busy. Sorry, there's a lot going on. I'm not able. And so headquarters sends him these European CIA agents to move things forward, but it doesn't work. What ends up happening, the key event, is that Lumumba escapes house arrest. He hides under the feet of his domestic staff leaving for the day and slips through a ring of troops surrounding his house. And he tries to make it back to his political stronghold in the east. He's caught with CIA help. Mobutu's in charge. The CIA is helping him find.
And Mobutu and Devlin are tight.
Very tight. They're meeting all the time. Devlin is handing him briefcases of cash regularly. And so Lumumba is captured while trying to escape, flown back to the capital, thrown in military prison where it's hoped that he'll never be able to escape again. But then something interesting happens. And the timing here is important. This is now December 1960. So the Kennedy administration is about to come in. Eisenhower's on the way out. And this sets off intense fears on the ground in Congo that Kennedy will come into office and have a more pro-Lumumba policy. And those fears are not only among Mobutu and his henchmen, but also in the person of Larry Devlin, who's terrified that he thinks Lumumba is totally unreliable, will turn communist, turn the country communist. And so he learns that Lumumba is about to be sent away to his death, and he does two things. One, he doesn't try and talk Mobutu out of this, which is essentially a green light in the context of their intense relationship. And two, he keeps headquarters in DC out of the loop because he fears rightly so, that he'll be told to put the brakes on this operation. Don't let Lumumba be killed. That would be too much of an explosive thing for Kennedy to come in and deal with. This policy on Congo is a question for the new administration. We don't want any big moves. So to finish the story of how Lumumba is ultimately killed, he's flown to this breakaway province of Katanga, tortured the whole way, tortured upon landing, and then taken into a remote clearing in the woods and shot by Congolese soldiers answering to Belgian officers who are in charge of them, who in turn are answering to the local secessionist government. It's January 17th, so just 3 days before Kennedy.
I thought it was amazing that you have a picture in the book of a bedraggled Lumumba in like 1959 or something like that, like coming off an airplane after he's been thrown into prison, and the Belgian officer who's escorting him off the plane is the guy who basically killed him. He gave the order to the firing squad, right?
Yeah, so there's this man, Franz Verschuur, who, there's sort of this weird parallelism to it. In, I think it was December 1959, he's still under Belgian colonialism. Lumumba's been arrested for allegedly inciting a riot, but really just giving a fiery political speech. And yeah, the man who is dragging him off a plane would end up seeing him a little over a year later in January 1961 and be organizing the whole operation that night.
So it was from June 30th to January. That's a really short period of time, and this entire legend of Patrice Lumumba comes out of a very, very short period of time. But what do you think? Well, first, just to focus on the Soviets for a second, because there's been so much sense of this being in a Cold War context, which it obviously was. When the Soviet archive was opened after the fall of the Berlin Wall, what did they find about Soviet interest in the Congo?
Well, there basically wasn't anything on the Congo because it turns out the Soviets were not particularly interested in Congo. You wouldn't know it from their propaganda, but in 1960, the Soviet Union was much weaker than it would become. Congo was physically very far away from it. Its interests were much more in Eastern Europe. And it didn't view Congo as a place that was ripe for communism. It was a largely Catholic country. It was politically disorganized. The Belgians had prevented any communist influence from penetrating Congo for the entirety of their rule. So it was not a place that was a viable communist state from the Soviet perspective. Of course, the Americans at the time sort of saw Soviet apparitions everywhere they looked.
And Lumumba wasn't ideological particularly, and so then, but the American government considered it, starting in the Kennedy administration, considered it this great success, great CIA success, and it kind of became the template, right, for what followed.
Yeah, I think there was this sense, this was a big test of covert action. There had been other things before, Iran, Guatemala, but in Congo, that was the first time you had a presidential order for an assassination operation, which ultimately wasn't what killed Lumumba, but the CIA, as I explained earlier, did have a hand in it. And so it was seen as a victory. You got rid of this potentially pro-Soviet, pro-communist, unreliable leader, and in Joseph Mobutu, you installed this friendly, pro-American tyrant. So what was not to like? So then you have Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, and
Diem assassination.
yeah, so
Vietnam,
and sort of
63.
history
Yeah.
throughout the rest of the Cold War.
Maybe even the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the Contras, the whole collection of anti-communist guerrillas funded by the CIA, you argue, in some ways grows out of this early success.
Yeah, I mean, it was viewed unabashedly as a victory. Devlin got promoted. He earned at least one award for this. Even the church committee called the Operation in Congo the broader policy a success.
And Kennedy ended up liking Mobutu.
Yeah, I mean, so there was this brief moment before Kennedy took office where it seemed he might be pro-Lumumba if you looked at, depending on which advisors you talked to. But Kennedy takes office, Lumumba's dead by then. Interestingly, no one really knows that for about a month. And so only in February does the world learn that Lumumba's been killed. And at that point, pro-Lumumba policy is a moot point, and Kennedy falls in line, invites Mobutu to the White House, and becomes the first of many presidents to have a supportive relationship.
And then many years later, his widow, Jackie Onassis, spends really the last years of her life, the last 10 years of her life, 15 years maybe, with a guy named Maurice Templesman, who was this diamond merchant who was very close to Mobutu and did a lot of business.
Yeah, and the man he hired to be his man in Zaire, which is what Mobutu renamed Congo, was none other than Larry Devlin. After he retired from the CIA, he became Templesman's man in Congo.
Right, it's amazing. And what happened to Dag Hammarskjöld? We know him from Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza in New York, but there's a reason they named it that.
Right. So after Lumumba's death, the Congo crisis continues, and Katanga refuses to submit to central rule, and the UN decides to finally act on this, and has this sort of operation to round up all the Belgian mercenaries that are helping with the secession, and that goes south quickly. And so Hammarskjöld flies on a last-minute peace mission to Congo, destined for an airport just outside the Congolese border in northern Rhodesia, and his plane crashes on September 17th, 1961. And there would be many conspiracy theories about this for years afterwards. It's not clear exactly what happened. I'm a little skeptical of some of the conspiracy theories and think it's entirely plausible, perhaps the most likely outcome, in fact, that the plane crashed for the same reason that many planes crashed in 1961, which is pilot error. But it's a hotly debated thing.
I thought you were very convincing on that because there was no motive.
Yeah, as someone said, it would be like, Hammarskjöld was flying to negotiate a ceasefire, saying, okay, we, the UN, will stop fighting you secessionists. And so it would be like murdering Chamberlain on the way to Munich.
And what has happened in Zaire, now back to being called Congo instead of the Congo, in the last 60 years?
Yeah, so 30 plus years of Mobutu. He was extremely kleptocratic, repressive, ran the country into the ground, and in 1997 the bottom fell out. The Economist said there's no Zaire, just a Zaire-shaped hole in the middle of Africa, which I think sort of captured it well. And there's a massive civil war that is the collapse of the regime. He flees the country, dies of cancer a few months later, and then the country falls into this massive civil war, also known as the Great African War, which kills between 2 and 5 million people. That comes to a close largely, although there's still violence in eastern Congo. And since then, Congo's had a sort of succession of weak yet repressive governments, and they still to this day have not had a peaceful and democratic transfer of power in their entire history.
And some of the figures from the Lumumba period, they ended up after Mobutu coming into power, father and son.
Yeah, you could kill Lumumba, but you couldn't kill the strain of politics that he represented.
So I thought before we open up for questions, I just want to quickly have you tell the tooth story that you opened the book with.
Sure. So when Lumumba is killed, he's buried and then exhumed and then buried and then exhumed again because the officials there want to get rid of his body and pretend this never happened and leave some sort of mystery about who did it. And his body is eventually dissolved in sulfuric acid, but the Belgian police commissioner who is in charge of that task keeps as a souvenir 2 of Lumumba's teeth and 1 of his finger bones. It's sort of these gruesome trophies from his job. And he would later show this to a television documentary, and then there was a bit of an outcry, and so he claimed he threw the teeth into the North Sea, and then he died, and everyone forgot about this. But in 2016, his daughter was interviewed on the anniversary of Lumumba's death and said to a reporter, "Oh, I actually have one of the teeth," and went into another room and produced this tooth. And so that the Belgian government ended up seizing that as evidence in a criminal case looking into people associated with Lumumba's death. And finally, just last year in 2022, the tooth was returned to the Lumumba family, flown back to Congo, put in a coffin, toured the country, and then has been laid to rest in Kinshasa, the capital.
Okay, quite a story. Questions, thoughts?
It's a great story. I was just wondering, how would you describe Lumumba's politics? Because I guess he was suspected that he was a communist sympathizer, but there wasn't any evidence of that. Or, how would you describe what he really thought?
Yeah, he never had a chance to actually put in place a political agenda because the mutiny was on day 5 of independence, so he really only had 4 normal days. But we do know some things about his views. For instance, he struck a deal with an American entrepreneur to hand over Congolese mineral rights and hydroelectric rights to an American. So that's one piece of evidence about his orientation in the Cold War. Another is that when he was in DC, he called on the US government to send American troops to Congo to stabilize it. So neither of those things are what you'd expect of someone that was pro-Soviet. I think fundamentally he was anti-colonial. He wanted his country to be neutral. He said that again and again. He said, for Congo there are no blocks. But he never really had a chance to develop a true political ideology or legacy.
People just project onto him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up a little bit on that, the projection on Lumumba the martyr, Lumumba the symbol of anti-colonialism and Pan-Africanism. Could you please talk a little bit about that and how the influence that he had on other revolutionary and anti-colonial movements?
Yeah, well, in a strange way, his death was probably the best thing for his legacy because he could, everyone could wonder what could have been, and he didn't have to stay in power and make the hard choices that perhaps any leader of Congo would have had to have made. So he became this martyr. The Pan-African thing, that was real. He really did consider himself an avowed Pan-Africanist, meaning, the continent, we're all engaged in the same collective struggle. But he kind of got adopted by the left after his death, and so Sartre wrote this introduction to a collection of his speeches. But if you look at his actual words and policies, there isn't anything particularly leftist about them. So I think, had he lived, it probably would have been, some sort of socialist, but not communist type of regime.
Well, there's African socialism.
Right,
which
but he
is
probably wouldn't,
separate
he
from
may not have
communism.
even stayed in power that long. We'll never know.
I mean, you talk about it, what a bad administrator he was, that he was super, in his 5 days, I guess, but he was out of the country, in his few months in power, he was out of the country for much of the time, but he wouldn't allow anybody else to make any decisions while he was gone, because he had to make every decision about everything. It sounded like Mobutu would have, even if he had not had an alliance with the CIA, that Mobutu, just being a tough character, would have figured out how to use the army to overwhelm him pretty quickly.
Potentially, and I mean, but Lumumba, as you said, I mean, he saw, I love this detail, he saw personally to the management of the garage of his residence, which reminded me, you probably know whether this is true or not, but about Jimmy Carter, apparently he would sign off on White House tennis court usage. Is that not true?
Well, in my book, I actually disproved that story. It was actually his secretary, Susan Clow, who was forging his initials, and she sent me the documents that proved
Oh,
it. So
good to know. So Lumumba was
So-
worse than Carter then.
way worse. Carter, actually, his attention to detail was extraordinarily helpful in
Yeah.
his many under-heralded achievements.
Yeah, so interesting. I'm wondering, what is his legacy, Lumumba's legacy, globally or in his own home country?
Yeah, I mean, globally, as I said, I think he's really become this leftist hero and seen as sort of flawless. And I mean, he obviously didn't deserve his death, but he did make decisions that could have been made differently. And so part of the goal of my book was to sort of complicate that picture and just look at Lumumba, the man, the leader himself. In Congo today, he's quite popular, although not universally popular, especially in Katanga, which still has a tradition of independence and being apart from the rest of Congo. He's not universally loved there, but he really did just become a symbol, and people brushed away the details of his actual life.
I love how in the Chinese, you say at the end of the book, and the Chinese built memorial to Lumumba. The sculpture of him, the statue of him, doesn't
He looks nothing like him, yeah.
like him at all. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. The first is, was there any sort of American strategy for Congo after Lumumba was gone, beyond just installing Mobutu? And how is America's relationship with Congo? What has that looked like since Lumumba? And then also, just for you, are there any factual loose threads that you wanted to tie that you weren't able to, or something you wanted to include but just couldn't quite verify?
So to answer your second question first, the CIA has an internal history of its operations against Lumumba. We know the subtitle of this document, we know that it's something like 54 pages, but it's still classified in full to this day,
Wow.
63 years later.
That's
So I would
amazing.
love to get my hands on that. There's been a FOIA request for it, but those take years, sometimes over a decade. So, that's very frustrating. To answer your first question, the strategy very quickly became support Mobutu, which was a simplistic strategy, but on some narrow Cold War level, it worked. He's the anchor of stability in this chaotic country. Therefore, he's a CIA, operative. Basically, we're giving him cash every month. Support him. Have a little bit of a legal fig leaf over his regime, which he then did away with in 1965. the US support continued and continued, and only at the end of the Cold War did America sort of finally dump Mobutu. What's funny about it is, the goal was to have this pro-American autocrat, but Mobutu did things that Lumumba would never have gotten away with. He called in North Korean military advisors. He kicked out 2 US ambassadors for being insufficiently respectful for him. So you didn't really get what you paid for in a way. And then the relationship with Congo after that has been, basically one of supporting it with a certain amount of humanitarian aid, also though making sort of the same strategy of supporting authoritarian-ish leaders in the name of stability rather than having a sort of full-throated defense of democracy there.
Yes.
Okay, I have to apologize first because this is very emotional for me. You said at the beginning that was be like 17 African countries became decolonized. And I'm sitting here thinking, trying to say it nicely, my whole life, so many of these countries have actually never been decolonized. So, like the French-speaking West African countries had to sign the agreement to continue colonialism, right? So we were told they would decolonize, but they had this freaking agreement with it. Still colonies, right? Because we use French money, the CFA, deposited in France, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm looking at the book, and I don't see, no, that's not. I'm just wondering how much of this game plan continues to exist and be played in Africa via CIA, ethnic division. Talk about the Afro-Arab, Swahili speaking population. It's unimaginable. I look at the fall of Gaddafi and the emergence of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, for example. Right? Prior to the U.S. that happening, and U.S. entering AFRICOM in these countries, there were 2 cases of terrorism in the entire continent. Over the last 5 years, there's 3,000 in Niger, Mali, and Guinea, the places that have broken away. And so I'm just looking at this. I love the book, appreciate it, but I don't see any change in American policy. I only see it getting worse. That's my first statement. My second question is very specific. Senegalese scholar Sheikh Anta Diop said that the Zaire River has enough natural power to generate enough electricity to light the entire African continent. And I'm just wondering what's the present state, if you know at all, of hydroelectric power in Zaire.
So your second one's easier to answer, which is that the Inga Dam has been this long-running dream for Congo where there are significant untapped hydroelectric resources. My understanding is that those plans have never really gotten off the drawing board for 60 plus years. I don't know the specifics of it today, but I know that that's long been this thing in the works and it's long been never happening. To answer to respond to your first statement, I think when you said that a lot of these countries were never really decolonized, I think a lot of that happened in Congo, where the Belgians formally granted independence to Congo, and that did have a lot of real aspects to it, but couldn't quite accept that they were no longer in charge. And so, to give you just one example, before independence, the Belgian plan imagined that, this is 1960, spring of 1960, they imagined that Congo's ambassadors to foreign countries would be Belgians, so that the Congolese ambassador to Japan would be a Belgian diplomat, for instance. That all changed very quickly, but it speaks to just what you're getting at of sort of this inability to fully grasp with that, freedom and freedom. As for the more modern day aspect, I think you can make a pretty good argument that the US hasn't really learned a lot of the lessons of the Cold War in Africa. Namely, one, to not be paranoid about your geopolitical rival. So in Africa today, there's a lot of hyperventilating on the US part of the Wagner Wagner Group and Chinese influence. In fact, most African countries just want to chart their own course and develop, and you don't have to counter every aspect of Chinese or Russian influence. And then the other flaw that I think continues is this sort of over-reliance on military ties. So the US, Mobutu was originally a military leader, backed him, saw him as the strong man who could hold Congo together. In the Sahel and West Africa today, there's still a strain of that US policy, sort of picking the military leader who seems stable rather than allying yourself with the broader population and democratic forces.
I would just have like one small addition to that. I think the point on China is a great one. They're really overreacting to China's presence in Africa. The Chinese actually aren't making a lot of friends with their Belt and Road initiatives there. I would say U.S. policy in Africa over the last 60 years is not a straight line. It's stops and starts, and it really does depend a lot on who's president. So, like I did extensive interviews with Andrew Young for my book, and when he was ambassador to the United Nations under Jimmy Carter, he brought some pretty dramatic change in the way that we dealt with Africa. I don't have very much about that in my book because I have to cover so much ground, but there's an outstanding book by an African American scholar whose name I'm not remembering right now about.
He's from Hunter. He's my professor.
Yeah, there's a really good book about the Carter administration in Africa, and it started with Carter telling Andy Young, as both Young and Carter talked to me about, that instead of us saying, here's what we want you to do in Africa, because the Cold War is still on, to the leaders of African countries or their ambassadors at the UN, it was, well, what would you want from us? And so they just they flipped the script on the whole conversation in 1977, and that became the basis. Didn't solve all the problems, didn't mean the CIA wasn't still active in the Horn of Africa and other parts, but it was a change in the relationship. Then things got worse under Reagan, particularly in southern Africa, where Reagan was, fine with apartheid, basically. And then they got better in the Clinton and Obama administration. So it's a kind of it's a little bit like Lumumba. It's sort of a complicated story, I guess I would say. Yeah.
I think you mentioned that the CIA team on the ground was concerned that Kennedy would have a different point of view for how to manage the situation. Why do you think that? And was there this was an election year, right? So was there anything as far as foreign policy in Africa that Kennedy was saying that was different than Eisenhower?
Yeah, so to my own surprise, in 1960, Africa was a campaign issue in a way that would be unimaginable today. And so it's sort of cynical bit of political triangulation that Kennedy was doing, which was that he talked a lot about Africa in his campaign, and he claimed that the Eisenhower administration was bungling its Africa policy and not sufficiently aligning America with African nationalist aspirations, and therefore letting the communists gain ground. This was in part a strategy to win over African American votes without talking about civil rights, which would alienate Southern Democrats that he wanted to vote for him. So there was that campaign rhetoric, which I don't want to make too much of. It wasn't his entire campaign, obviously, but it was there. And then he had certain advisors like Chester Bowles, who were sort of more pro-UN, less hardline anti-communists, had a more supple understanding of third world politics. And so there was a real strain of policy in the Kennedy camp of let's strike some sort of deal that might bring Lumumba back to power. After all, he's the most popular politician in Congo. Let's sort of reorient our Congo policy. And so Mobutu knew that was happening, and Devlin knew that was happening.
It's just very quickly, this exchange program that Barack Obama Sr. came to Huayan. It became an issue in the campaign, and such an issue that Jackie Robinson, who had been a Republican, switched to Kennedy because he didn't like the way the Nixon campaign was responding to this group of students from Africa who were coming over to study in the United States, and it was amazing to me that this actually surfaced as a campaign issue in 1960. Yes.
Me?
Actually, I was pointing just behind you because you had one, right? Go ahead.
Yes, our question is after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, was there any African liberation movement leader who followed up with for his struggle, or was willing to die or sacrifice his life like Patrice Lumumba did for the cause of African liberation?
In Congo, certainly there was this whole rebellion in 1964. So what happens is Lumumba dies in January 61. There's sort of a brief political stability period, and then in 1964, the country sort of explodes, and there are these two separate rebellions that end up merging basically, and they anoint themselves the successors of Patrice Lumumba and carry on his movement, in their words. And when the CIA had to set up basically a massive paramilitary operation in Congo just to put down these rebellions because Mobutu was so incompetent and unable to do it. So his death had that particular consequence, which was that you then got this rebel movement of people who were allied with him.
Just thinking of some questions that were just asked. I know that Women for Women International withdrew from Congo a few years ago because of violence. What is generally the situation now with governance and violence in Congo?
Not great. So the current president of Congo, Felix Tshisekedi, he took office in 2019 after elections held the previous year, but he didn't actually win the most votes. Someone else did, but he was in this sort of corrupt deal. He was named president. So you have an undemocratically elected leader. You have vast swaths of the country that are unstable and still a lot of armed groups. In the east, there are over 120 armed groups. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. 70% of the population lives on less than $2.15 a day. So it's not a happy place.
All right, I think we have time for one more in the back.
You know, I'm wondering, I have a lot of, you've raised a lot of really interesting questions about the content, but I'm really just wondering as an author, what about this story sparked you to devote so much time and effort into telling it?
So I had the opportunity to travel to Congo in 2014 for something that was more current events focused, and that got me reading about the history. And I think the fundamental puzzle in my head was, this was front page news of the New York Times every single day in 1960. It was the big Cold War crisis. Why have I never heard of it? Why do I know nothing about it? And so I wanted to answer that question.
Great reason to write a book.
I guess I could have just read a Wikipedia.
Thank you.